All right, let's talk about the Great Depression. We've all heard the classic story, right? A tale of Wall Street greed and market failure. But what if that whole story is wrong? Today, we're going to dig into a really powerful argument that the real culprit wasn't capitalism, but the government itself.
So between 1929 and 1933, the U.S. economy didn't just have a bad spell, it literally fell off a cliff. The total amount of money out there, I'm talking every single dollar in every bank, in every wallet, shrunk by a third. Think about that. A third of the country's money just vanished. This wasn't a recession. This was a full-blown monetary collapse that dragged the entire world down with it.
For decades, the story we were told was pretty simple. The Roaring Twenties were this wild, out-of-control party thrown by big business, and the Great Depression was the nasty, inevitable hangover. And that idea really stuck, you know? It led to this widespread belief that government has to step in and save capitalism from its own worst instincts.
But the source material we're diving into today, it completely flips that script. It argues that the Great Depression wasn't about the failure of the free market at all. It was a massive, and here's the key word, preventable failure of government policy.
Now, to really get this argument, we have to go back in time. But we're not starting in 1929 with the stock market crash. Nope. Our story actually starts more than 20 years earlier with a totally different financial meltdown, the Panic of 1907.
So back in 1907, rumors and fear started spreading like wildfire. People got spooked and rushed to the banks to pull out all their cash. It was a classic bank run, and it showed a huge crack in the whole system. What's crazy is that even perfectly healthy, solvent banks were on the brink of collapse, all because of pure panic. So you might be wondering, how can a perfectly good bank fail? Well, here's the thing. Banks don't keep all your money sitting in a big vault. They can't. They have to lend most of it out. That's how they work. It's called fractional reserve banking. But it creates a problem. If everybody shows up at once and demands their cash, the bank physically doesn't have it on hand. And this quote just nails the dynamic perfectly. The fire might not even be real, it could just be a rumor. But the stampede for the exits, that's very real, and it can be just as destructive. The fear itself becomes the weapon.
And you can see how it just spirals out of control. A little bit of fear about one bank causes a rush. That bank runs out of cash, which seems to prove the fears were right. So the panic spreads to the next bank, and the next, and the next. It's a terrifying domino effect.
After the chaos of 1907, the government decided, okay, this can never, ever happen again. So they created a brand new institution, the Federal Reserve. Its whole job, its entire reason for being, was to be the ultimate financial firefighter. A lender of last resort that could spray cash at a panic to keep the system from burning down. And you know what? For a little while, it seemed to work brilliantly. The 1920s were a period of incredible growth and relative stability. It looked like the new firefighter in town really had things under control. A huge amount of that success was credited to one man, Benjamin Strong. He was the head of the New York Fed, and by all accounts, he was a genius who really knew how to steer the ship and keep the economy on an even keel. But then, tragedy struck. Benjamin Strong died suddenly in 1928. Just 1 year, one single year, before the biggest financial test in American history. His death left a massive power vacuum at the Fed. It became rudderless, tangled up in petty infighting, right at the moment when the world desperately needed a firm hand at the wheel. So, the stock market crashes in October 1929. The stage is now set. What should have been a pretty bad, but ultimately manageable recession was about to be turned into a generation-defining catastrophe thanks to the Federal Reserve's mistakes. This timeline? It's like watching a train wreck in slow motion. At every turn, instead of stepping in to help, the Fed either did nothing or it did things that made the situation actively worse. I mean, who raises interest rates in the middle of a historic economic collapse? It's just baffling. According to our source, the real point of no return came in December 1930 with the failure of the Bank of United States. Now, despite its official-sounding name, it was a private bank, a big one, and a healthy one. But it served a largely Jewish clientele, and when a rescue plan was put together, anti-Semitism among the other powerful bankers reportedly killed the deal at the last second. They just let it fail. Joseph Broderick, the New York superintendent of banks, was literally in the room as this was happening. He pleaded with them, telling them they were about to make a colossal mistake. His words are just absolutely chilling to read now because he was 100% right. The bank's failure shattered what little confidence was left and kicked off waves of new bank runs across the country. And this chart just lays it all out, plain and simple. On the left, you have all the things the Fed could have done, the very things it was created to do. provide cash, support the banks, be the firefighter. And on the right, what it actually did. Stood by, let them fail, and even jacked up interest rates. They didn't just fail to put out the fire, they basically poured gasoline on it.
So what was the damage from this cascade of failures? Well, when you look at the evidence laid out in the source material, the verdict is pretty clear, and it's absolutely devastating. Just look at these numbers. It's staggering. In 1929, the United States had about 25,000 banks. 4 years later, less than 15,000 were still standing. A huge piece of the American economy had just disintegrated.
That's 10,000 banks. Vanished. Think of all the businesses, all the families, all the life savings that disappeared with them. And this wasn't some natural disaster. This, the source argues, was the direct result of a monetary collapse that the Federal Reserve had the power, the tools, and the duty to prevent.
But the story doesn't end there, because what happened after the disaster is maybe the biggest twist of all. A really tragic irony.
So get this, the very institution that failed so spectacularly never really got the blame. Instead, the whole thing was pinned on unstable capitalism. This mistake fueled calls for way more government intervention, and the Federal Reserve? It actually came out of the crisis stronger, with a bigger budget, more power, and even a fancy new building in Washington.
And that leaves us with a really provocative question, doesn't it? This whole re-examination of history suggests the greatest economic tragedy of the 20th century wasn't proof that capitalism is broken. It was a lesson in the catastrophic failure of government. Which kind of makes you wonder, have we learned the right lessons? And where should we be looking for the real sources of economic instability today?